I want to tell you something that happened to me 8 months ago, and I still think about it almost every day. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet peace I didn't expect to find. My name is Loretta. I'm 63 years old. I live in a small bungalow in Sudbury, Ontario. The same house where I raised my son. The same kitchen where I learned to make butter tarts from scratch, because his father loved them. The same front porch where I sat every evening after my husband's passed, and tried to figure out what life looked like without him in it. That was 6 years ago now. You'd think I'd have it figured out by then. Mostly I do. But some days, you realize the grief isn't really about the person you lost. It's about the version of yourself you thought you'd get to be. The grandmother at the table. The mother who mattered. The woman whose children still called on a Tuesday for no reason at all. My son's name is my son Nathan. He goes by Nathan Caldwell now, though he was born Nathan James Pruitt. He took his wife's last name when they married, which I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't mind. Rebecca Caldwell came from money. Old money. The kind that's so old it doesn't feel the need to announce itself, except it does, in every single choice a person makes. The way she said, cottage, instead of cabin. The way she corrected the server at restaurants without ever raising her voice. The way she looked at my kitchen the first time she visited. Just a half-second glance, the kind you can't quite prove, before asking if I wanted help refreshing the space. Nathan met Rebecca when he was 27. He was already doing well by then. He'd built a small tech consulting business in Toronto, nothing flashy but solid. He was proud of it. I was proud of him. When he met Rebecca, things changed, and I don't mean that entirely as a criticism. She pushed him. She had connections. Her father, a man named George Caldwell, knew people across 3 provinces, and within 2 years of their marriage, Nathan's business had doubled and then doubled again. I watched my boy transform from the kid who used to fix the neighbor's computers for $20 into someone who wore suits that cost more than my monthly pension. I'm not a jealous woman. I want to be clear about that. I never wanted his money. I never asked for anything. After his father died, Nathan offered to move me into a condo in Toronto. Closer to him, he said. I said, no, Sudbury is where I belong. My friends are here. My church is here. My garden is here. I have a tomato plant that's been coming back for 4 years now, and I am not leaving that tomato plant. But I will tell you this, honestly, because this story deserves honesty. I knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that things had shifted between Nathan and me. The calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. When he did come, it was usually with Rebecca, and the visits had a certain texture to them. Polite, slightly formal, like we were people who knew each other, rather than people who belonged to each other. I told myself it was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. I told myself that right up until the evening of the Caldwell Foundation dinner. The Caldwell Foundation was Rebecca's family charity. Arts and education. Very respectable, very well attended. Every autumn they held a gala at the Renfrew Hotel in downtown Toronto. I had never been invited before, so when Nathan called in September to say there was a seat for me at their table, I was genuinely touched. I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen, and held my hands together and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, included. I want to tell you exactly what I wore that night, because it matters to this story. I wore my navy blue dress, the one I bought at Pennington's 3 years ago for my niece's wedding. It's a good dress. It fits well. I wore my pearl earrings, the ones Howard gave me on our 30th anniversary. I polished my shoes. I had my hair done that morning at the salon on Elm Street. I looked at myself in the mirror before I left, and I thought, I look like a woman who raised a good son. I thought that was enough. I took the bus to Toronto. Not because I couldn't afford the train. I could. But because the bus is where I've always felt comfortable, surrounded by ordinary people going to ordinary places. I had a window seat. An older man across the aisle was reading a Western novel. A young woman with a baby was singing softly to keep him calm. I ate the sandwich I'd packed, and watched the trees along the highway turn to the suburbs and then to the city, and I thought about Nathan, and about how proud his father would have been. Nathan met me in the lobby of the Renfrew. He looked beautiful. My boy, my son, in a charcoal suit, his hair neat, everything about him polished and composed. He hugged me. It was quick. Over my shoulder, I could see Rebecca talking to someone near the entrance to the dining room, her back to us, and I remember noticing that she didn't turn around. We went inside. The dining room was extraordinary. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, round tables with white linen and low floral arrangements. I counted at least 15 tables. Ours was near the front. When we reached it, Nathan pulled out a chair for me and I sat, and I smiled at the couple already seated across from us. A man and woman in their 50s, very well dressed, who introduced themselves as Richard and Linda something. I didn't catch the last name over the noise. They were donors. Significant ones, I gathered. Rebecca took her seat beside Nathan. She glanced at me, then at my dress, and she smiled. But it was the kind of smile that is actually an assessment, and I've been alive long enough to know the difference. The evening started pleasantly enough. There were speeches. There was wine, which I didn't drink, and sparkling water, which I did. Richard was funny and easy to talk to. Linda asked me about Sudbury and seemed genuinely interested when I mentioned the garden. I thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this will be a good night. It was around the time the main course arrived that it happened. I had leaned over to ask Nathan quietly whether he might be able to call me a cab at the end of the evening. I didn't know Toronto well enough to navigate it alone, especially at night. It was a simple question, a practical question, a mother asking her son for a small thing. He looked at me, and then, in a voice that was low but not low enough, a voice that Richard and Linda and the woman to my left could all have heard, he said, "Mum, honestly, you should have thought about that before you came. People like you don't really belong at events like this. It's a bit embarrassing. People like you. I don't know if you've ever had the ground disappear beneath you while you're sitting completely still. That's what it felt like." The chandeliers kept shining. The room kept talking. Someone at the next table laughed at something, and I sat there, in my navy blue dress and my pearl earrings, and the words just settled over me like cold water. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. I didn't flinch. I have lived 63 years on this earth, and I buried a husband, and I sat in hospital waiting rooms, and I planted things in cold ground and waited for them to come back. And I have learned, the hard way, the slow way, that the moment you cry is the moment you lose yourself. So I didn't cry. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip, and then I reached into my purse. My old purse, the brown one I'd had for 7 years, the one Rebecca had glanced at twice during the evening, and I took out my phone. "Excuse me for just a moment," I said very quietly, to no one in particular. I stood up from the table. I walked, slowly and steadily, past the other tables, through the gilded doors at the back of the dining room, and out into the corridor, where the carpet was thick, and the noise of the gala fell away behind me. I found a bench near the coat check and I sat down on it, and I held my phone in my hands for a moment, and then I made a call. The phone rang twice. A man answered. Douglas, my solicitor, Douglas Ferris. I'd known Douglas for 22 years. He'd handled Howard's estate. He was, in many ways, the most sensible person I had ever met in my life. "Loretta," he said, because I'd called his cell and he recognized the number. "Everything all right?" "Not exactly," I said. "Douglas, I want to change the trust documents. We talked about this 2 years ago after Howard passed, and I said I'd wait. I don't want to wait anymore." There was a pause. "You're sure?" "Yes," I said. "I'm very sure." "All right," he said. "Come in Monday. We'll get it done." I thanked him and ended the call. I sat on the bench for another minute or two, just breathing. A young woman from the coat check glanced over at me with that particular look. The slightly worried look. And I smiled at her, because she hadn't done anything wrong and there was no reason to alarm her. Then I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked back into the dining room. Nathan was watching the door when I returned. He had a look on his face that was somewhere between guilt and defensiveness, which is a very particular look that parents learn to recognize before children learn to hide it. Rebecca was speaking to Linda about something. Richard was checking his phone. I sat down, folded my napkin back into my lap, and asked Richard if he'd tried the salmon. He hadn't. We talked about the salmon. The conversation moved on. Nathan said very little for the rest of the evening, and I did not press him. I called a cab myself at 9:30. I said my goodbyes warmly and sincerely. I liked Richard and Linda, they were good people, and none of that was their fault. Rebecca gave me a careful hug at the door. Nathan walked me to the lobby but didn't come outside. He said, "Safe trip home, Mum," in a voice that was trying very hard to sound normal. "Of course," I said. And I meant it. I got into the cab and went to the bus station and came home. Now let me tell you something about Howard and me, because you need to know this to understand the rest. Howard Pruitt was not a flashy man. He drove a used truck. He wore the same winter coat for 11 years. He coached minor hockey on weekends for 23 years. Never asked for a thing in return. People in Sudbury knew him. Not because he was rich. He wasn't, not for most of his life. But because he was decent, and in a small city, decency travels further than money. What people didn't know. What I didn't fully understand until Howard got sick, and we had long, honest conversations in hospital rooms, was that Howard had been quietly, carefully investing since his 30s. Not in anything dramatic. Index funds. A few properties. A business stake in a friend's mining supply company that turned out to be worth considerably more than anyone had anticipated. Howard had the gift of patience and the great wisdom to never spend money simply because he had it. When he passed, I inherited an estate that surprised even his own brother. Not a fortune by Toronto standards, perhaps. But by any honest measure, a very substantial sum. I had a financial advisor, a calm, methodical woman named Sandra Shen, who I trusted completely, and together we had managed it carefully for 6 years. I had never told Nathan the full picture. Part of it was Howard's way. He didn't believe in handing children a sense of entitlement before they'd earned their footing. Part of it was mine. I watched Nathan succeed on his own, and I was glad. I didn't want my money to be the reason for anything in his life. Not his choices, not his relationships, and not, as it turned out, the way he treated me. The trust documents, when Howard was alive, had always named Nathan as the primary beneficiary of the estate. Not all of it. I've always believed in giving while you're living, and I had contributed quietly to causes I cared about. A women's shelter in Sudbury, a bursary fund at the local college, my church. But the substantial portion, the properties, the investment accounts, the proceeds from the mining stake, had been designated for Nathan. After that Monday with Douglas Ferris, they were not. I didn't do it in anger. I want you to believe that, because it matters. I didn't do it because I wanted to punish him. I did it because something became clear to me on that bench in the corridor of the Renfrew Hotel, holding my old brown purse in my lap. My son had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was a liability, an embarrassment, something to be managed and minimized, and I realized, sitting there, that I had been allowing that. Quietly, gently, telling myself it was normal, telling myself it was just distance, telling myself that if I was patient and kind and undemanding, things would find their way back. They weren't going to find their way back on their own. I understood that now. The new trust directed the primary estate to 3 places. The women's shelter, which I increased considerably, a new bursary I established in Howard's name at the college, and a conservation land trust that protects a stretch of boreal forest north of Sudbury. Howard had fished there as a boy, and it seemed right that some piece of him would stay there. There was still a provision for Nathan. A modest one. I am his mother. I did not erase him. But it was a very different number than what he had been expecting. If he'd been expecting anything at all, Douglas handled it efficiently, and without drama, the way Douglas handles everything. By the following Wednesday, it was done. I signed the documents, shook Douglas's hand, drove home, and planted the last of my fall bulbs. I did not call Nathan. He called me, about 6 weeks later. A Sunday afternoon in November. I was making soup squash from the garden, and my phone buzzed on the counter. I saw his name and I let it ring twice before I answered. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Hi, Mum." A pause. "How are you?" "I'm well, making soup. How are you?" "Good. Yeah, good." Another pause. He was working his way toward something. I could hear it. Nathan has always been a deliberate talker. He likes to find the angle before he commits to a direction. "Listen, I've been thinking about the dinner. At the Renfrew," I said. He stopped. I said something that wasn't fair. "To you. I don't really know where it came from, but it wasn't. It wasn't how I meant." He stopped again. "I'm sorry, Mum." I stirred the soup. "Thank you, Nathan," I said. "I appreciate you saying that. Are we okay?" I thought about what to say for a moment. Not to be cruel, not to prolong anything, but because the truth deserved the right words. "We will be okay," I said. But things have to be different. I'm not something you manage. I'm your mother, and I'm not asking you to be ashamed of me. I'm just asking you to remember who raised you and what that person deserved. Can you do that?" He was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can." "Good," I said. "Come for Christmas. Bring Rebecca if she wants to come," he said he would. "I should tell you one more thing because it's part of the story and you deserve the whole of it." About 2 months after I changed the trust, Nathan had lunch with his cousin Felicity, my brother's daughter, a plain-speaking woman whom I adore, and somehow, in the way these things happen, the subject of my finances came up. I don't know exactly what was said. Felicity called me afterward, slightly worried, and mentioned that Nathan had seemed stunned. That he'd had no idea. That she thought he might have assumed, in the way that children sometimes assume, that I didn't have much, that the old purse and the bus trips and the 10-year-old winter coat were the whole picture. "What did he say?" I asked her. "He said, 'Why didn't she ever tell us?' I thought about that for a while. The honest answer is, because it wasn't his. It was Howard's, and then mine, and what I did with it was my business, and I had every right to decide what it was for and who it would serve. My son's comfort and my son's expectations were not automatically claims on what I'd built and what I'd tended and what I'd carried forward. But there's another answer too, the one I keep coming back to. I didn't tell him because I wanted to be loved as Loretta. Not as an account balance, not as a name in a will, not as a resource, or a liability, or a connection, or an embarrassment. Just as myself. Just as the woman who raised him, who packed his lunches and watched him sleep and held his hand at his father's funeral, and has been quietly, steadily, stubbornly here for 63 years. I wanted to know what I was worth to him when he thought I had nothing. Now I know. Christmas was quiet. Nathan and Rebecca came up to Sudbury on the 23rd and stayed 2 nights. Rebecca helped me make the butter tarts. She asked me to show her how, which I hadn't expected, and we stood in the kitchen together, and it was genuinely not uncomfortable. Nathan fixed the latch on my garden gate that had been sticking for 2 seasons. He didn't make a production of it. He just went outside with a screwdriver and fixed it, and when he came back and his nose was red from the cold and he said, "It should hold now, Mum." I made him a cup of tea and said, "Thank you." That was all. Sometimes that's enough. I don't know where things will go from here. Families are complicated and long, and there is still work to do. I know that. Rebecca and I are not yet easy with each other, and I think there are things Nathan still needs to understand about what happened and why. But I'm not in a hurry. I have my soup and my garden and my tomato plant and my pearls. I have Douglas Ferris on speed dial. I have a forest north of the city that will now be protected because of Howard, and that makes me feel, in some deep and wordless way, that everything is in its right place. And if you've ever sat in a beautiful room and been made to feel like you didn't belong there, by a stranger, by a colleague, by someone who was supposed to love you, I want you to know something. You don't fight that with anger. You don't fight it with tears. You don't fight it at all, really. You just stand up, very quietly, and you make the call you should have made a long time ago. And then you go home, and you plant your bulbs, and you wait for spring.